I've been assigned to talk to you about the historical and spiritual connections between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And this is a very big topic, huge topic, in fact. Many of you probably already know that Islam is the last of the major world religions, certainly of the major monotheisms to emerge in the world. It emerges in the 7th century. Many of you are historians, so you know this as well as I. Emerges in the 7th century. So by this time, Christianity is well institutionalized. Judaism is into its rabbinic period significantly, both very developed traditions by this point. Okay, now I'm going to see, do I point it at the computer? There we go. It's not very big. But when Islam, of course, comes into the world, it emerges in the Arabian Peninsula, initially in Mecca. Its significant history takes place in Medina on this western coast of the Arabian Peninsula. But if we look at the larger context in which it emerges, we see that it emerges in the context or in the shadow in some ways of two great ruling dynasties at that time, or empires, I should say, which is the Byzantine Empire, of course, ruling Syria, Palestine, Egypt, across North Africa, and the Persian dynasty, the Sassanid dynasty in Iran and parts of Iraq. Now, obviously, you know that the major religion of the Byzantine Empire was Christianity, and its particular Orthodox brand of Christianity was dominant in the areas that it controlled, but other forms of Christianity were also practiced along the eastern coast of Africa here, and there were also minority sects of Christianity, of Christians in fairly large numbers in Iran and Iraq as well. When we look at the Arabian Peninsula, it may look like this central portion especially is somewhat isolated from what's going on in other parts of the Near East. But it's not entirely. As you'll see, Yemen is quite close to the eastern coast of Africa, as is the entire west coast here. And of course, this part of Arabia also very close to Iran. And so the Persian dynasty, the Byzantine Empire, were also engaged in trying to extend their influence, political influence and economic influence into the southern part of Arabia as well. Now, what was the religion of the people in the central part of Arabia before the coming of Islam? Well, to be honest, we don't know all that much about Arabia before the coming of Islam, but it's quite clear that a good number of people in the Arabian Peninsula were what we might call pagan or polytheistic. Many of them seem to have believed in some kind of single overarching creator god, but to have had multiple deities that they worshipped as well, sometimes in forms that were idolatrous in nature. But even though this central part of Arabia was largely pagan, it was not isolated from the Jewish and Christian worlds around it, or from the larger geopolitical situation entirely. First of all, the Arabs in this central part of Arabia traveled. They traveled to Yemen and north into the Syria, part of the Byzantine Empire, for trade. And the peninsula itself was not devoid of Jews and Christians, quite the contrary. There are a number of Jewish tribes that lived in Arabia. There were some Christian tribes, although most of them tended to be north on the borders with the Byzantine Empire. And you also had a number of monks or hermits that literary sources tell us about, and historical sources mention in passing, who happened to be there in Arabia, right, who went out into the desert. Yep. So when Islam comes into this situation, it comes into a part of the world that is in many ways saturated with competing religious claims, with competing religious cultures. Christianity itself was diverse. You have Zoroastrianism as the state religion of the Persian Empire. And then you have Arabia itself which has pagan and polytheistic traditions mixed with some Jewish and Christian tribes as well. Okay. Now, the tribes in Arabia, or the population in Arabia at this time, again, it's not entirely clear what their religion consisted of exactly. We don't have very many records of Arabia prior to the coming of Islam. But one of the things that seems to be the case is that there were a number of shrines, particularly cubic shrines like this one, that were spread in various parts of Arabia and that were recognized as places of worship. Right? Some of them dedicated to a particular deity. And this one you might recognize in particular. Of course, it doesn't look like this in pre-Islamic Arabia at all. But what is this? I'm sure you know what this is. This is the Kaaba in Mecca. Right? And the Kaaba in Mecca is not a religious shrine that emerges after the coming of Islam, but the Kaaba was already a religious shrine when Islam emerges in Mecca. And it was one of many that were spread throughout the region. And the tribes, of course, many of the tribes in Arabia were nomadic or semi-nomadic, and so as they traveled, they might visit these various shrines as well. And this shrine in Mecca, the Kaaba in Mecca, was already, before the time of Muhammad, associated with a pilgrimage festival where tribes would come throughout Arabia to Mecca and perform pilgrimage rites here at the Kaaba. There is some evidence that perhaps even Jews and Christians in Arabia may have also participated in these pilgrimages, although, again, not entirely clear. So when Islam comes in the 7th century, when Muhammad starts receiving revelations from the Quran, it is revealed in Arabic, the language of the people of Arabia. But the content of its message, the method of its argumentation, the kinds of stories and moral accounts that it gives are very much speaking to a diverse religious population. It comes and it doesn't just speak to pagan Arabs. It speaks to Jews, it speaks to Christians, it speaks to this whole diversity of competing religious claims. Now, to give you just one example of this, what is the major name, the most common name for God in Islam? Allah. Now, it's a debate whether or not Allah is an actual proper name for God, or whether it's an elision of the Arabic al-ilah, which means the God. But in either case, we can see that this name Allah, or the word for God in general, ilah, seems quite close to other words for God that would have been known particularly to Jews or to those who speak any Semitic language. El is one of the names for God in the Hebrew scriptures, right? He's also sometimes referred to as Elohim, which is a plural form. Muslims also sometimes say Allahumma, which is very similar. All of these very famous Hebrew names like Daniel and Gabriel and Emmanuel and Elijah, all of them have this El in it, which is a reference to God. And this El does not emerge just in Hebrew, but even the Canaanites seem to have a name for God that was similar to this. So this sound El seems to have been a widespread Semitic sound that was associated with God. But it wasn't just Jews and Christians that may have heard Allah and thought of God in a Semitic context, linguistic context. But the Arabs, certainly the Arabs of Mecca, also knew who Allah was. Allah was also God in pre-Islamic times. And one of the ways we know this is by the name of Muhammad's father. Muhammad's father, the founder of Islam, his father's name is Abdullah, the servant of Allah. So even in this name that is used, there are many names, as we're going to see tomorrow in my lecture on the Quran. There are many names that the Quran gives to God, but Allah is the main name. And this is a name, again, that would have been recognized to some extent by the diversity of religious groups in this general Near Eastern region.